right, pull up a chair and pour yourself something strong. This isn't my story I'm telling tonight. It belongs to a young lieutenant I had the honor of serving alongside back in Vietnam. It's about how the war we knew took a man fresh out of West Point and reshaped him right down to the bone. His name, well, let's call him Richard. You gotta understand, Richard wasn't just some kid who got drafted. He was born into the Army. His father was a full-bird colonel in the Corps of Engineers, a true hero from 2 wars. I'm talking about a man who put troops on Utah Beach in World War II and then commanded a regiment in Korea, landing men at Incheon. The kind of man whose shadow is long enough to cover 3 suns. Richard and his 2 younger brothers, James and Stephen, they looked at their old man and saw a giant. It was only natural they'd all try to fill his boots. Richard was the first, marching right into West Point and graduating with the class of '67. When he first got to the academy, he told me, Vietnam was just a whisper, a place on a map. All the training, all the talk was about Korea and Europe. They spent their days wargaming a clash in the Fulda Gap against the Soviets. But by the time they were seniors, cadets with rings on their fingers, that whisper had become a roar. There was no more talk of Germany. They all knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their guts, that their war was waiting for them in the jungles of Southeast Asia. I remember him telling me about the mess hall at West Point Washington Hall. A grand old place. But in those years, it became a place of grim announcements. An officer would stand up, silence the room, and read the name of a recent graduate who'd been killed in action. He said, his class, 67, and the class of 66, they got hit the hardest. 30 men killed from each class. 30. He said he knew almost every single one of them. Imagine that. You're trying to learn how to lead men, and every few weeks you're reminded of how easily that leadership can get you and them killed. That's a heavy weight for a 21-year-old to carry. Richard chose field artillery. He wanted to command the big guns, and he got his posting, the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, a legendary outfit. After graduation in June '67, he got 2 months of leave, a last taste of home, before heading to Fort Sill for Artillery Officer Basic. But getting into the 101st came with a catch. There were 6 lieutenants from his class tabbed for the division, and the Army needed them in country yesterday. So, they were given a choice. Gentlemen, you can keep your assignment to the 101st, but you'll have to skip Ranger School. They were, however, allowed to go to jump school. For a young officer dreaming of being airborne, that was no choice at all. Of course, they all took the deal. A few jumps out of a perfectly good airplane, and by the end of November '67, just 4 months after pinning on those gold bars, they stepped onto the soil of South Vietnam. He never forgot the moment he arrived. They landed at Bien Hoa, or maybe it was Long Binh, the big bases all blurred together. The ramp of the C-141 transport plane lowered, and it was like opening an oven door. The heat, he said, it wasn't just hot, it was a physical thing. A heavy, wet blanket that smothered you. And then the smell hit him. A smell you only find in a war zone. It was a cocktail of diesel fumes, exotic spices from the local food stalls, the rot of the jungle, and something else, the acrid, unmistakable stench of human waste being burned with jet fuel in 55-gallon drums. You never forget that smell. In the distance, the low thud of artillery rumbled through the air. The sergeants on the tarmac just grinned at the wide-eyed new guys. "Don't you worry, LT," they'd say. "Those are the outgoing mail. It's the incoming you gotta listen for." His unit, the 2nd and 3rd Brigades of the 101, had just been flown in on a massive airlift of C-141s and C-5As. They were replacing the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, up at Phuoc Vinh, about 50 miles north of Saigon. It was there they learned a new word. They weren't just airborne anymore. They were airmobile. That meant choppers. Huey Slicks and Chinooks became their buses, taxis, and ambulances. It meant constant combat assaults, flying low over the treetops and jumping out into a hot landing zone, never knowing what was waiting in the tree line. In his 13 months in country, that job took Richard everywhere. He served in all 4 core areas of South Vietnam: I, II, III, and IV. From the DMZ to the Mekong Delta, he saw it all. As an artillery officer, his first job was forward observer, an FO. He described it as having the best and worst job in the infantry. You're assigned to a rifle company, in his case, Delta Company, 1st of the 506th Infantry, and your job is to live, eat, sleep, and fight with the grunts. You sit, as he put it, in the back pocket of the company commander, with a radio on your back and a map in your hand. You are the wrath of God on call. When things got bad, you were the one who could make it rain, steel and fire from miles away. Back at the main base in Phuoc Vinh, life had a semblance of normalcy. They lived in Quonset huts, those half-moon-shaped tin buildings that were either boiling hot or freezing cold. He shared one with another lieutenant, a platoon leader. They had cots, mosquito nets, and a locker for their gear. But they didn't spend much time there. Most of their lives were spent out in the boonies. They'd set up temporary fire bases on remote hilltops, living in dirt and sandbag bunkers, sleeping next to the big guns. And when they were on search and destroy missions deep in the jungle, it was even more primitive. Every single night, they'd dig. They'd carve holes out of the earth, just big enough to curl up in, set up listening posts, and ring their position with claymore mines. He said the nights were the worst. The jungle comes alive after dark with 1,000 sounds, and your imagination turns every one of them into a VC sneaking through the wire. You lie there, sweating in your hole, hand on your rifle, praying for the sun to come. That period, late 67 and early 68, was the run-up to the Tet Offensive. Intelligence kept saying the enemy was taking a beating. Richard said they were constantly told they were winning the war, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. They got into small skirmishes, little firefights, that were over as quickly as they started. But you could feel something building. The air was thick with it. The enemy was planning something big. And then it came. Their real test, their baptism by fire. It was the Battle of Song B. Song B, he explained, was a provincial capital north of their base at Phuoc Vinh. It sat in the bend of a small, shallow river you could walk across. It was supposed to be a friendly town. But the NVA, the North Vietnamese regulars, had other plans. For Delta Company, this was their defining moment. They went into that village And they fought street to street, house to house. It wasn't jungle warfare. It was a brutal, close-quarters brawl. They accomplished their mission. But the cost was staggering. The company had 4 lieutenants leading the platoons. By the time the guns fell silent, one was dead, and 2 others were so badly wounded they had to be evacuated. Just like that, 3/4 of the company's leadership was gone. Richard saw firsthand what a disciplined, well-armed NVA unit could do. This wasn't the local Viet Cong they were used to. This was a professional army. As the enemy's push started to falter, word came down that 2 of our quad-.50-450 caliber machine guns mounted on a turret, a devastating weapon, had been overrun and captured by the enemy. For Richard, the worst moment of his entire tour was about to happen. He and a sergeant from an armored cavalry unit saddled up on a patrol to recover the American dead and wounded left in the village. That's when he saw him. Lying near one of the captured gun positions was the body of Dick Fox. Dick Fox was the lieutenant Richard shared a Quonset hut with back at Phuoc Vinh. His bunkmate. They'd shared stories, letters from home, stale coffee. Dick was engaged to be married. He was just days away from leaving on his R&R leave to meet his fiancée. Richard knelt down, looking for a bullet wound, a cause, but all he saw was a ragged tear on his friend's temple where a piece of shrapnel from a mortar shell had punched through his skull. He told me, his voice quiet even all those years later, I was just struck by the mortality of it all, looking down at him. I knew, by the grace of God, that could have been me. That should have been me. He said that single, horrific moment changed everything. It stripped away the bravado, the sense of immortality you have when you're 22 years old. It made him a man of faith, right there in the dirt and blood of Song B. That image, he said, was the hardest thing he carried from his 13 months in Vietnam. The cavalry sergeant, true to his job, managed to disable the quad-.50s so the enemy couldn't turn them against other American troops. They couldn't just call an artillery strike on the guns. They were in the middle of a village, a restricted fire zone. They gathered up the bodies, including Dick's, but lost another man killed on that same patrol. Richard always maintained that they did their job. They retook the village and handed it back to friendly forces. But he never forgot the price Delta Company paid for that small piece of land. After Song B, with the infantry company so shot up, the Army pulled Richard back to his parent artillery battery. He spent the rest of his tour as a fire direction officer, the FDO. Instead of being out in the field calling in fire, he was now in a command bunker, plotting the coordinates and giving the firing commands to the gun crews. He was still in the war, still moving all over Vietnam as the 101st chased the enemy. But he was one step removed from the immediate personal violence. His tour was supposed to end in January 1969, but he got lucky. He was able to get out a month early, just before Christmas. He remembered boarding the commercial jet-chartered flight they all called the Freedom Bird, and the sheer, overwhelming relief of it. He had survived. He was going home. He was so giddy that when the plane took off from San Francisco for the next leg of his journey home, he bought a full bottle of Chivas Regal whiskey and drank the entire thing before they landed. The rest of that flight, he'd say with a chuckle, is a little hazy. When he finally landed at his home airport, one of the first pieces of advice he got was to change out of his uniform and into civilian clothes as quickly as possible. There were anti-war protesters at the airports, and they weren't known for being kind to returning soldiers. Imagine that. You survive a year in hell, and you have to hide the uniform you wore doing it. Vietnam changed him, and it changed his career path. He didn't stay in the artillery. He put in a transfer to the Corps of Engineers, the branch his father had served in, the one he'd always wanted. He went to Fort Belvoir for advanced training, and there, as he put it, he got tangled up with the aviation types. One of his new friends took him up in a Cessna T-41, the military version of a 172, and taught him how to fly. On a long shot, Richard applied for the Army's fixed-wing aviation program. He knew the chances were slim for an officer who wasn't a brand-new lieutenant, but, to his shock, he was accepted. Flight school was a new beginning. While he was learning to fly, he met and fell in love with the woman who would become his wife. They'd been married for what must be close to 50 years now, with 2 kids and 5 grandkids. Life, as he often said, turned out pretty good. The Army, of course, had plans for him. He was slated to go back to Vietnam for a second tour, this time as a pilot. He was trained on the U-8 Seminole, a twin-engine utility plane. But when he reported to his final training class at Fort Huachucac, Arizona, the instructors noticed something on his record. He was the only officer in the class who had already served a combat tour in Vietnam. An officer came to him and said, "Lieutenant, we have another assignment for you." That other assignment was about as far from Vietnam as you could get, Saudi Arabia. He spent a short tour in Riyadh, flying that U-8 for the Corps of Engineers. They were overseeing the construction of military bases for the Saudi government. But his main duty, and he'd always tell this part with a big laugh, was the Tea Party flight. See, it was a dry country, but the U.S. government had an arrangement. Every military and civilian contractor working for the Corps was authorized a monthly liquor ration, 2 bottles of hard liquor, or 1 bottle of liquor and a case of beer. It was his job, as the aviation officer, to fly the plane that brought in the booze. He swore up and down that it was the most pressure he ever faced in his entire military career, Vietnam included. "You can't," he'd say, "be the guy who fails to deliver the liquor ration. You will never live it down." After Arabia came Germany. But the army he found there was not the one he had joined. It was the early days of the Volunteer Army, or Valor. Discipline was breaking down, and racial tensions were at an all-time high. It was a powder keg. For his last 7 months in Kaiserslautern, his official title was Race Relations, Alcohol and Drug Control, and Equal Opportunity Officer. He was basically the complaint department for an entire garrison of unhappy soldiers. The tension was so bad, he heard rumors of barracks being burned down on other bases, of old-school sergeants walking around with a round chambered in their 4 or 5 pistols, just waiting for trouble. This wasn't the army of professionals he'd known. In 1974, after 7 years of service, he resigned his commission. Leaving the military, Richard followed in his father's footsteps one last time. He went back to school, got his master's degree, and became a civilian geotechnical engineer. He worked in Texas for a while, before moving to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he started his own engineering firm. He built it from the ground up, and by the time he retired, it had 120 employees in 10 different offices. A real American success story. He doesn't go to the big 101st Airborne reunions. Too many ghosts, maybe. But he never lost touch with his roots. He goes back to West Point for all his class reunions, and every time he's in Washington, D.C., he makes a pilgrimage. He walks down to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, to that long, black wall. He walks along the polished granite until he finds the panel he's looking for, and there he runs his fingers over a name, Richard A. Fox. It's his way, he said, of remembering the price that was paid, of seeing the names of his classmates and his friends, etched forever in stone. Vietnam never left him. It changed the entire course of his life. But he believes, in the end, it changed him for the better. It forced him to confront his own mortality at a young age, and led him to a deep and abiding faith that has guided him ever since. In a broader sense, he thinks the war changed all of America. It taught a generation to question authority, to not blindly trust its leaders. Soldiers don't start wars, he'd always say. Politicians do. Soldiers just do what they're told. He always carried a bit of a chip on his shoulder about how Vietnam veterans were treated when they came home, but he was inspired to see how that attitude has changed, to see young soldiers today being thanked and honored in airports, not spit on. Every now and then, Richard goes back to West Point to speak to the young cadets, the ones who are about to step into the same world he did all those years ago. And he always leaves them with the same piece of advice. I hope you all have a wonderful 20-year career, but understand what you are getting into. Just keep your faith and make the Academy proud. And that's the story of Richard, a good man who went to a bad war and came out the other side better for it. I was lucky to know him.